Medics responded to a 911 call about a child not breathing. This has now escalated into a homicide investigation. Dorothy's two boys, ages 5 and 2, were taken from the home and placed into protective custody. How can this guy do that? This is just a baby, a little tiny child who has no way to fight back or protect herself. Neighbors reported that Randy Rhoden and Dorothy Wing were involved. Randy Rhoden and Dorothy Wing met recently. He moved in with her just weeks before Stacy Wing's tragic death. Born on January 22, 2019, Stacy lived in Seaside, Oregon. Dorothy met Randy during Halloween 2022. A week later, Randy moved into Dorothy's apartment, where she lived with her 3 young children, including Stacy. As Stacy approached her 3rd birthday, Randy began regularly caring for the kids while Dorothy worked. In the following month and a half, the children suffered numerous injuries. By December 19, 2022, Stacy was lethargic. In the early hours of December 20, she was found dead in her bed. Dorothy called 911. Police arrived and found that the child was not breathing. Emergency responders discovered Stacy in full rigor mortis, covered in bruises and injuries, lying on her side in her mother's room. Stacy had not been bathed recently. Discoloration surrounded her neck, a lesion was on her head, and blood was found in her earlobe. Marks were also visible on her other ear, and there were fingernail marks near her mouth. Her left arm had injuries from shoulder to wrist, wrapped in an ACE bandage. A doctor noted a deformity in her humerus. Wow, a deformed humerus? I don't think I've ever heard that before. Both hands had adult-sized bite marks on every finger, and she was missing a fingernail on each hand. Bruises covered both legs in multiple places. An autopsy confirmed Stacy died from blunt force trauma. Randy, Dorothy, and the other children went to the police station. A caseworker from the Department of Human Services evaluated the kids and noted their injuries. The children were taken into custody for further assessment. The children were taken to Randall Children's Hospital. A pediatrician specializing in child abuse confirmed that their injuries were consistent with abuse. Meanwhile, the deputy medical examiner performed Stacy's autopsy. The deputy medical examiner concluded that Stacy died from battered child syndrome, with blunt force trauma as a significant factor. The state obtained a warrant to search Randy's phone during the investigation. Dorothy later told police that Stacy was injured from falling off the toilet days earlier. You must be kidding! You don't get all those injuries simply from falling off the toilet? The other boys had similar injuries. The children received medical treatment. One boy told police that his mother and Randy often kept the kids chained up inside the apartment. With this evidence, Randy was arrested and charged. An indictment revealed that Randy had been mistreating Stacy since October 2022. He had also harmed the 2 boys, aged 5 and 2. Randy had a criminal history, including a domestic violence case in 2020. The case involved 2 women with charges of sexual assault, threats, and kidnapping. This guy is a real piece of work. Randy pleaded no contest to coercion and was sentenced to 10 months in prison. Randy Rhoden violated his probation by moving in with Dorothy Wing without permission. Dorothy Wing was also arrested. Dorothy Wing was indicted on 8 charges, including murder by assault and 6 counts of criminal mistreatment. The prosecutor noted she left her children with Randy Rhoden. Knowing Randy Rhoden's violent history, the prosecution built a timeline to illustrate his role in the children's deaths during the trial. The timeline showed that while not perfect, the family was generally healthy before Randy's arrival. Dorothy had a job, and the oldest child attended school, with only minor medical problems. Photographs from the previous summer depicted the children as happy. Everything changed when Randy arrived, having known Dorothy for only a week. He was revealed as a dishonest, drug-addicted man with a violent history. The state noted that Randy Rhoden, more than Dorothy Wing, cared for the children, giving him the opportunity to mistreat them. Leading up to the incident, DNA evidence from clothing, drug tests, and testimony from acquaintances indicated that Randy Rhoden harmed the children, not Dorothy Wing. Several medical experts were called to testify. 2 medical examiners testified about the children's injuries and potential causes. They confirmed blunt force head trauma caused the girl's death, noting hemorrhages in her scalp and skull. There was significant brain trauma described as a severe concussion, along with numerous injuries to her head and body. They noted cauliflower ears, a condition linked to physical abuse. This condition results from damaged blood vessels and dead cartilage. She had multiple contusions, abrasions, and lacerations on her face and head, with some infected. The medical examiner noted that the tissue between the girl's lip and teeth was destroyed and infected. This damage was believed to be caused by trauma to her mouth. Her left arm was purple and swollen, with a spiral fracture to the humerus. The examiners indicated that a break in her arm likely resulted from someone grabbing and jerking her. Various areas of her torso, arms, hands, and legs showed signs of trauma. The state called a pediatric professor as a witness. He reviewed medical records and stated the injuries resulted from multiple episodes of inflicted trauma. 4 doctors and an ER nurse corroborated the injuries of the other 2 children. They generally agreed that the boys had been assaulted. One child had a marked and swollen face with hemorrhaging in both eyes, typically seen with direct trauma, leaving them nearly swollen shut. His scalp showed red bumps and lesions. The doctors identified healing burns on his nose and ears, which were bruised and encrusted. Extensive damage was noted in his mouth. This damage can result from blunt trauma. His lips and tongue had lesions. His hands showed lacerations, abrasions, bruising, blistering, and crusting, with a smolder mark visible. His fingers were bruised, and he suffered from a skin infection. Scattered marks and abrasions covered his torso. His pelvis was fractured, considered a high-force injury, which is very unusual for a child. The injuries to the other boy were severe. He had hemorrhaging in his ears, scabs, and abrasions on his nose. His face showed bruising, swelling, and tenderness. He also had a puncture wound in his mouth, causing air to enter the soft tissue of his jaw, leading to further bruising and swelling. Additional injuries included bruising at the base of his skull, ears, and scalp. His injuries extended to the neck, shoulders, torso, hip, and groin. A lesion on his right forearm resembled an ulcer mark, alongside a deep laceration on his thumb. Randy Rhoden's defense took a different approach, shifting blame to Dorothy Wing, whom he described as manipulative, violent, and abusive. Rhoden claimed the children were abused and needed medical care, but insisted Dorothy was responsible. He referenced her statements and those of other witnesses about her treatment of the children. He presented photographs showing the children with injuries before his arrival. Rhoden asserted that Stacy died from sepsis caused by a staph infection. While acknowledging blunt force trauma, he claimed it was not the cause of her death. Rhoden maintained that a severe staph infection entered Stacy's bloodstream, causing abscesses in her heart, brain, and lungs, leading to organ failure. The defense's medical experts focused on this infection and sepsis. Rhoden called a pediatric forensic pathologist as a witness. She testified that staph invaded the bloodstream, resulting in a fatal case of sepsis. This condition, she explained, could progress quickly into irreversible shock. She concluded that bacterial abscesses in Stacy's heart contributed to her death and stated she died from sepsis. The pathologist criticized the medical examiner for not investigating infectious causes further. She noted that more biopsies of Stacy's heart should have been taken, given the presence of invasive bacteria. The defense argued the medical examiner's conclusions were insufficient. They contended it was improper for any forensic pathologist to state Stacy died from head trauma rather than sepsis. During cross-examination, the prosecution's experts confirmed the presence of infections in her body. These included infections in her brain, heart, lungs, and scalp. They agreed that her heart began to deteriorate before it stopped beating. The prosecution stated that the bloodstream infection likely caused these infections. Rhoden's attorneys questioned the medical examiner's choice not to test for infections. The examiner explained that such testing would have been futile due to the rapid bacterial growth and limited conclusions. Despite this, Rhoden's attorneys pressed on, arguing there was evidence suggesting Stacy may have died from the infection. They pointed to various wounds as indications of that infection. They claimed the infection was further supported by bacteria found in the home. Rhoden also stated that the 2 boys were heavily infected, but acknowledged this did not account for the burns and bite marks. The defense argued that the bites and burns were misidentified signs of infections. They noted that doctors prescribed heavy-duty antibiotics, claiming the wounds disappeared after treatment. However, the state presented testimony confirming that the children suffered from human bites. This evidence indicated that an adult inflicted the injuries. A forensic odontologist was called to testify. Despite the defense's claims, they maintained that the bites and burns were merely misidentified symptoms of infections. They emphasized the necessity of heavy-duty antibiotics for the boys. The state, however, proved that the children had human bite marks. This evidence demonstrated adult involvement in causing the injuries, leading to the testimony of a forensic odontologist. The odontologist examined photographs of the children's injuries and confirmed that the marks were bite marks on the chin, wrist, and ears, all consistent with adult bites. Prosecutors described this case as the worst instance of child abuse in the county's history. In 2024, Randy was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Dorothy, however, pleaded guilty to manslaughter and criminal mistreatment, receiving a 15-year sentence due to her agreement to testify against Randy. After his sentencing, Randy appealed to the Oregon Court of Appeals. They ruled that the prosecution failed to establish a sufficient scientific basis for the expert testimony on bite marks, leading to a dismissal of that evidence. Consequently, Randy was resentenced to 20 years. With numerous injuries mentioned hands, mouth, legs, skull, torso, Randy's 20-year sentence was seen as a disgrace. Share your thoughts in the comments. It's a disgrace. He injured the torso and more, yet received only 20 years. What are your thoughts?